I hope you enjoyed last week's podcast on my presentation of why the church changed from Passover to Easter. And I hope that if you have any questions, you've been able to get in touch with me and I've been able to answer them. But if you haven't yet asked any questions, please feel free to do so. I'm going to pick up on the story about the appointed times that were first celebrated by Cain and Abel. So this is my presentation. These appointed times were first celebrated by Cain and Abel, who worshipped God by way of making offerings to God in accordance with his instructions. All the appointed times, with the exception again of the seventh day of rest, which is Sabbath, involve offerings and sacrifices, and Cain and Abel did just that. Noah did the same when he and his family finally came out of the ark. Sadly, his grandson Nimrod didn't. And Nimrod established a community and a priesthood of worshippers to the sun gods and built a tower with a chapel at the top of this worship system to be practiced. God's calendar of worship was determined by the moon, but Nimrod's worship was set to the pattern of the sun and became a worship system totally opposite in timing and, of course, purposes to God's worship system. From Nimrod's worship system, many gods were created by the priesthood, and paganism, meaning someone who worships many gods, spread across the world. For my purpose in this particular article, I want to refer only to a goddess called Ostra, and I will return to this goddess later. Now, I want to introduce you to the importance of the Jewish people in our story, or rather in God's master plan. And they were called into being a special group of people through Abraham, who was from a Babylonian city called Ur. And his calling was about 1800 BC. Abraham's father and their community worshipped many gods. In fact, his father Terah was an idol merchant. And I don't mean he was lazy. I mean he traded in idols of the gods and goddesses of the time. God then guided Abraham to a land we now know as Israel and established a home for him and for all his generations there. God's purpose in this was that Abraham and his children and their children's children would become messengers by the way they lived, and that their message was that there is only one God, one true form and calendar of worship, and a manual for living which the Jewish people would follow to demonstrate God's unfailing love and mercy for all humans, so that pagan communities would understand freedom and not be enslaved by the ways and purposes of their pagan leaders and ultimately the worship of their gods. This manual was written down for us all to read by Moses, a descendant of Abraham, and is known as the laws of God, or better described as the Torah of God, and is contained in the first 5 books of the Bible. So this is the purpose of the Jewish people, and the land of Israel became the focal point of the practice of the Torah. Many in Christendom have been taught that these books, which contain the Torah, are books to be ignored. But that's not true. Yeshua taught that we should obey the laws they contain, as they are a roadmap to freedom, both spiritually and physically, and most importantly, books of healing in our relationship with God and with each other. So it is important that we understand that, as I have explained earlier, sin enslaves us, but God sets us free. So thank you for this week, and Shabbat Shalom, and we'll carry on next week. Bye, Mike Fryer, Wales.